Уважаемые участники,
Good day, dear participants of our expert discussion that is devoted to comprehensive anti-corruption reform, modern challenges. Today, we are having our expert discussion in an online mode. We have a list of speakers, and after the speeches of our participants, you will be able to ask your questions or make comments. In order to do so, you can use the questions and answers function or the chat function, or you can raise your hand. Not so long ago, we've adopted a new concept of the anti-corruption policy for 2022 to 2026. And at first sight, it seems that the analysis of different solutions is quite easy, but today we will listen to the opinions of the representatives of the Anti-Corruption Agency, and we see that some of the actions are being postponed until 2026, which means that the effects of the anti-corruption reforms may go down. And we're going to talk about that today. Also, the experts of the civil society plan to present and discuss strategic recommendations in the field of anti-corruption, and this is linked to the demonstration of the political will, as well as improvement of the effectiveness and increase in the responsibility for corruption. This involves further criminalization, asset recovery, as well as real prevention of corruption in all the sectors of international cooperation. Today, we have the representatives of the Anti-Corruption Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan, representatives of key government bodies, representatives of parliament, the legal society, academic circles, non-governmental sector, and international organizations. Our expert discussion is arranged under our project in LPRC, Legal Policy Reforms Center, that is being implemented together with the British Embassy of Nur-Sultan, and we are really glad to receive the support of the British Embassy. The official languages of this discussion are Kazakh, Russian, and English, which means that you can use the interpretation function if you're attending our event online on Zoom. So you can just press the interpretation button on Zoom and enter the relevant room for interpretation. I would like to pass the floor for welcoming remarks to the advisor, to the chairperson of the Anti-Corruption Agency, Madam Anar Zharova. Anar, I suggest that you take the floor and provide your welcoming remarks. And since you are our next keynote speaker, who is going to talk about the anti-corruption reforms, you can take the floor and get down to your main presentation. Please, the floor is yours, Anar. Thank you. A good day, dear participants. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Agency of Kazakhstan, Anti-Corruption Agency of Kazakhstan. I would like to first of all thank the Legal Policy Reform Center and the British Embassy for arranging this event. I'm really glad to discuss the anti-corruption related issues with the expert community. In the last couple of years, we've been actively cooperating with LPRC in terms of the development of this concept as well. Madam Zinovich, for example, was one of the participants who recruited experts for the development of the draft legal acts. And I would like to mention the participation in the International Forum of the Compliance Development in Kazakhstan, because that event took place back in 2018. We also attended a series of seminars intended for the development of anti-corruption compliance. We plan to attend another important meeting. That's the second school on anti-corruption compliance for the representatives of the state bodies. And I really hope for our further fruitful cooperation with the LPRC. Dear participants of this meeting. As you know, on the 2nd of February of 2022, the president of the country approved the concept for anti-corruption policy for 2022 to 2026, as well as the action plan for its implementation. The agency, as an authorized body, implements the new strategic document, and when developing measures, we first of all focused on the opinions of our citizens, trying to take into account their concerns. A special website was created to collect all the proposals and ideas from our citizens, public organizations, expert community, and business community, and we took them into account when developing this concept. We took into account the international experience as well as international standards in the field of countering corruption. And we focused on our strengths and weaknesses in this process. We were also guided by our own experience, the results of criminal cases, and the results of external corruption risk analysis, which disclosed systemic problems on all levels of the state governance. And these problems, as well as their solutions, form the foundation for the measures developed. Let me focus on key moments. As you know, the success of curing any disease mostly depends on the right diagnosis. That is why we tried to analyze and show all the problems which directly or indirectly affect corruption. All of them are very well known to you. You see the list of these problems on your screens. They include the household corruption, lack of transparency in state procurement, high level of state involvement in the economy, administrative barriers, discretional norms, and etc. In order to resolve these problems, the concept prescribes 6 blocks of objectives, which include specific reforms and projects. The first block of measures includes the development of intolerance towards corruption. We understand that this does not imply quick victories, but nevertheless, this is one of the key objectives. Therefore, we develop a number of measures in order to develop the zero tolerance towards corruption. We are sure that it's important to promote anti-corruption values through the Family Institute, and therefore we intend to use the potential of the citizens of Kazakhstan. We are planning to include this into the educational system on all levels. Therefore, we started relevant work with the Ministry of Science and Education. Continuous education in the field of corruption throughout the whole period of this project means integrating these principles into the state apparatus, and large-scale awareness-raising work will allow the citizens learn more about their rights and freedoms without resorting to illegal means of resolving their problems. Therefore, we will use whole of the government approach in order to carry out this work across different groups. The workers of the government bodies, students, retired people, high school students, and other groups, other categories will be able to be a part of this specific work where different aspects will be taken into account. It is also important to ensure the good faith of the state apparatus. And in practice, we see that this question is not fully regulated. Our legislation still is missing some detailed actions, especially when it comes to conflict situations. And in the majority of advanced countries, this issue receives the utmost attention. Therefore, our legislation needs to be improved further on in this field. We've also tackled the issue of expansion of the authorities for the civil servants, for them to have additional sources of income, because the issues of corruption are above all economic issues, and a person does corrupt deeds in order to increase his wealth or in order to resolve his problem as soon as possible. That is why we need to create all the favorable conditions for the corruption to be non-profitable, both for the civil servants and entrepreneurs. When it comes to businesses, here we intend to fight against corruption through incentives for entrepreneurship in order to do open and transparent business. And we're going to introduce a number of anti-corruption standards. These are the anti-corruption clauses in different agreements, assessment of the good faith of counter agents, anti-corruption audits for potential corruption deals or corrupt deals. And in our opinion, good faith companies need to be incentivized or encouraged, maybe indirectly, or maybe through some other preferences or the state support systems and measures. In terms of further development of Anti-Corruption Compliance Institute, we plan to integrate relevant educational programs or courses into higher educational institutions' curricula. The second block of measures includes the minimization of the corruption opportunities. And here we need to ensure transparency of the budget-related processes. That implies the civilian monitoring of national projects, integration of public registers. The state funding needs to be implemented only when there are some measurable indicators available. The businesses are recommended to move to the project financing, which will exclude urgent signing of performance acts at the end of a calendar year. Overall, the integration of project management when implementing state documents and projects will become an effective tool to prevent corruption on all levels of state governance. In order to increase the economic effect from budget subsidies, it is really important to develop the principle money follow people through the per capita funding of socially significant spheres. We plan to implement the principle of painting money, which means that the money will be tracked until it's fully spent on for certain purposes. We want to ensure universal approaches towards the use of public money or funding. We'll continue to implement the measures aimed at mitigating or reducing the basis for doing procurement from the same source. And here we will have to find the average selling price that will ensure the reduction of the role of monopolies, which will increase the competitiveness or competition. We plan to improve the budget trade by offering a wider range of goods and services easily replaceable. That will ensure the effectiveness of the activities of the most entities. As regards the reduction of the role of the state in the economy, we will reduce the share of the state-owned companies in procurement. We will continue the comprehensive analysis in order to identify illegal or unfavorable functions with the further transfer of these functions to the competitive environment. Also, we will ensure the higher level of transparency in terms of decision making will focus on setting limitations or restrictions in terms of getting the state support for the organizations with the 100% share of the government, except for those spheres where the level of competition is not enough. As regards the quality digitization, it's one of the factors to reduce household corruption. Further use of advanced technological solutions by digitizing business processes of the state bodies, we will be able to exclude or prevent corruption in all spheres. The human involvement will be minimized by integrating informational systems, and that will ensure a more proactive involvement in terms of provision of the state services or the support measures, reduction of alternative methods for the provision of aid or assistance means the full use of the non-state platforms. We also plan to integrate the state digital expertise of laws and regulations. We will also take a set of measures to exclude corruption risks by developing and operating the information systems. And as our experience shows that for the time being, the information systems are quite vulnerable to corruption risks. There are problems of lagging, or there are cases of the failures of the system, and all of these leads to corruptions, which means that we're going to resolve these problems together with the authorized body. In order to reduce the shadow economy, we'll take forced measures to move to cashless payments. The concept prescribes a number of measures to improve the tools aimed at preventing corruption. Primarily, we will make the corruption risk analysis public by involving the public councils in the process of internal analysis, as well as monitoring and the development of recommendations, as well as implementation. As you know, this analysis for identifying corruption risks cannot be only done by the government. There is a need in doing the external analysis with the involvement of the agency or the authorized body. The development of the External Analysis Institute means the use of the project-based approach, which will ensure the effectiveness, personal responsibility, and comprehensive solutions. We also focus on the improvement of the Institute of Anti-Corruption Expertise, of the draft laws and regulations. It's based on the scientific approach, as well as it aims to form the intellectual potential. In order to ensure proper expertise of current laws and regulations, well, we've talked about this when we were developing the draft concept together with the civil society representatives, and here we plan to implement this concept through the Legal Monitoring Institute by introducing the compulsory discussion of its results together with the public councils. The third block of measures is aimed at irreversibility of responsibility. It's really important to introduce integrity checks. This institute will allow us to timely identify the civil servants in bad faith, thus to prevent corruption. For that, the heads of the government bodies on the first or initial stages of this process will be entitled to initiate such checks independently. In order to disclose criminal assets, in order to introduce the follow the money principle, we plan to introduce the Institute of Financial Investigation on a state level. The institute will make this process will help disclose illegal actions, and that will lead to the Universal Declaration, which will also help us reveal some illegal sources of income. This document is being considered by the lower chamber of parliament, and as a result of the first hearing, these documents were already approved. We plan to increase the accountability of legal entities for corruption. So it will be the responsibility of the company. Upon the recommendations of Greco and the OECD, we also take into account the measures on criminalization and bribery. Or promises of bribery. These instruments are preventive in nature and they're used all over the world. That is why we plan to introduce this instrument into our legislation. In terms of eradication of the household corruption, we will also pay attention to the workers of government authorities or non-state organizations, especially when they try to extort more money for their services. The fourth block is focused on the further involvement of the civil society in anti-corruption measures, and the public control is not going to be confined to the work of the public councils. We welcome the participation of everyone in order to form the culture of good faith. Therefore, the law on public control is highly important here, as it's going to define mechanisms and tools for the interaction of the civil society and the state apparatus. Also, this will form a more constructive dialogue with the civil society. At the same time, certain measures to eradicate illegal sources of information will be taken. We will take measures to expand the potential of the mass media and journalists and the issues of the fight against corruption.
Вопросом улучшения механизмов сообщения о коррупции, защите лиц, сообщающих о таких фактах.
and I will talk about the measures later. Some of them are considered in the Majlis. The fifth block is dedicated to the monitoring of anti-corruption policies. In order to do it efficiently and to respond, we are planning to create a special monitoring system. The possible platform can be the information system of the project management, which has been already introduced, and where everyday control is already done. The publicity of the system will allow the general public to participate in the evaluation of the efficiency of the anti-corruption measures and otherwise to participate. Also, we want to reflect the ratings of archivs and ministers with regard to prevention of corruption. Also, we propose to include the National Corruption Perception Index in order to control and to amend, if necessary, and not to be dependent on the international ratings. The sixth block is to improve the activities of the competent agency on combating corruption. Here we plan to expand integrated analysis instruments based on the big data. Also, we want to expand the powers of the agency in coordination of compliance services of the quasi-state service in order to provide the comprehensiveness of the measures. We want to reboot and review the role of the agencies in combating corruptions, including the corruption based on the crypto instruments and digital crimes. Here it requires education, re-education, retraining courses and other measures. Also, we want to improve our contact center 1424. In the same block, number 6, we have measures for international cooperation because it is in line with the competence of our agency. So we will continue implementing international standards and high quality recommendations of the international institutes, such as OECD and others. So this concept contains measures which, if they are implemented well, can really help preventing corruption. And we want to reach 47, a rating of 47. This is a very ambitious goal, but we are very positive about that, and we're very decisive. Thank you very much. Tatiana, your microphone is not on.
Спасибо.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for a detailed
Существует много.
review of the plans that are existing as part of the anti-corruption reform system. And partially, this is part of the concept. Some of them are new initiatives or evolving initiatives. And it's possible that today our speeches made by NGOs and civil society will have a lot in common. But I want to talk about the zones of the special attention in the anti-corruption reforms. As you know, the corruption perception index showed the decline by 1 point compared to the last year, but the last year we also failed to demonstrate any visible progress. The progress in anti-corruption reforms is struggling, requires lots of efforts, costs, and time. And Kazakh mass media often write about the corruption. Experts are talking about some recipes of successful anti-corruption reforms to be implemented in Kazakhstan. But I think that we are using half measures that the government is taking. Sometimes we think that the participation of the society would help in combating the corruption. But then there is a different opinion, and we don't use the most effective tools that actually allow to control the level of corruption. And sometimes we see ambiguity in this area. So today we are trying with experts today voice out the most efficient recipes and to offer recommendation to control the corruption to everyone who is part of this. President's administration, the Agency of Kazakhstan on Combating Corruption, corporate business, corporations, the society, court system, the government in general. And as we hope, these recommendations will be a good addition to the action plan on implementation of the anti-corruption policy concept for 2020-2026. What we are not doing well or correct. So I identified 5 reasons for that. In January 2002 in Kazakhstan, we had riots. And in the public speeches, one of the drivers of that situation was the systemic corruption was identified. And it's hard to doubt that corruption is everywhere at all levels, in all state agencies, including courts, police, prosecutor's office. We see all the types of corruption and all the problems related to inefficient control over it, lack of confiscation of the proceeds received from corruption crimes, real estate, movables, immovables that was purchased for illegal proceeds. And today we will try to talk about that. So we, the experts, I identified one of the reasons, one of the first reasons, the fact that there is no effective control. Corruption in Kazakhstan is a serious part of business, state, government, court procedures, court systems, budgetary processes. And we think that the control over the corruption can be done through the mechanisms of public control, such as independent mass media, investigative journalism, specialized NGOs, and the state control. And the more we have, but the more we have state control, and we're talking about a special committee in this area. The second reason would be that the entrepreneurs and civil servants, they are equally responsible for the corruption, and often they avoid any responsibility. For instance, guilty verdicts that we have in Kazakhstan, they reflect different corruption schemes. For instance, civil servants, they charge certain tariffs for giving benefits to the business, to the entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs are ready to pay that. Also, the civil servants, the officials promise lucrative contracts in the area of state procurement, and money, again, those kickbacks are paid by the business people. Also, there are threats from the state agencies, from the state officials. Basically, we're talking about extortion of briberies and the threats of checks, threats of examinations, threats of administrative, criminal cases, penalties, and so on. And then the entrepreneurs want to get the permits, want to get different certificates, licenses, customs clearance. And the third reason is that the political will to combat corruption is very vague nowadays. The situation after the January events of 2022, and we know that the systemic corruption was one of the reasons for that, or one of the triggers. So we think that the following elements are missing. There is no clear articulation from the heads of the regions, from ITs of the cities, about zero tolerance to corruption at all levels. And then second, lifting all immunities against any officials that could hinder the investigation of such cases and prosecution of corruption cases. And then, of course, we're talking about the political will for the criminalization of corruption crimes. And there should be a clear signal to everyone that the punishment for corruption will not be mild, will not be lax, that it's going to be hard. And it will be related to the deprivation of liberty, not the penalties or fines. Also, we lack the leadership in the anti-corruption reforms. And one of the good examples that could be an example of good behavior and initiation of the combating corruption in organizations and companies, we don't see that. And the reason number 4 is demotivation of the civil servants. We know that corruption is abuse of powers in order to get personal benefits, personal interest, and public interests are suffering. So when we study the guilty verdicts on corruption cases, we see that the heads of state agencies abuse their powers. Also, we see that the civil servants abuse their powers in order to get personal benefits, extortion of briberies from the citizens, from the entrepreneurs. And also, we see the embezzlement, forgery, or the so-called dead souls, which are getting the salaries, non-existing people. And when we don't see any efficient measures, this is not something of a surprise. Basically, this is something that is to be expected. Besides, we can pay attention to the lack of respect of ethical norms and rules. And the reason number 5, cooperation with international partners. It is not very straightforward. Of course, we are members of GRECO. We continue cooperating with UNODC, OECD, World Bank, international initiatives such as STAR, FAT, and so on. And such cooperation makes us responsible for observing our obligations. But often our position is that the most important obligations, such as to introduce effective criminal and non-criminal sanctions, including monetary sanctions for legal entities, or to criminalize the illegal enrichment. So these measures are not really taken, and they are suspended or later. And of course, that undermines our cooperation and doesn't add to the trust to our country on the part of the international community. And they really have a question, do we really want to combat corruption, or do we want some compromises? There are many examples. And the monitoring from international organizations, of course, now has been improved or will be improved in the nearest future. And we have to follow the recommendations very clearly instead of creating quasi-constructions that don't really help us to execute efficient control over corruption. What are the areas of special attention and active analyzing the situation, the perspectives and trends? We have identified 6 areas: political will and leadership. Number 2, effective responsibility of legal entities for the corruption. 3, criminalization of corruption. 4, return of assets. 5, real prevention of corruption. And 6, international cooperation. I will talk very briefly about 2 areas, about political will and international cooperation. And my colleagues will be talking about the other ones. As for the political will and the leadership of the first leader, here the recommendations to change the legislation can be as follows. First, we have to change the rule about civil servants. If there is a corruption and it is proven, then the leader, he needs to step down, and we have to change this rule. There should be some anti-corruption measures, programs, training of the personnel. Second, we have to legislatively introduce the responsibility of the first leader at all levels for introduction and development of anti-corruption compliance. Also, we need to introduce the rule of the personal example. The leaders of all levels should serve as a positive example and should motivate its subordinates to be honest, to do right things, to respect ethical norms and rules, and of course, that prevents the corruption on part of the leaders. And as for the leadership, we think is also the participation in anti-corruption activities, including training, information, awareness, so that the corruptions would not undermine the image of the organization. Also to inform about the conflict of interest. This is a very sensitive thing. It is not well utilized. As for the international corruption, it is important at this stage to have it on a high level without any manipulations. And on our part, the recommendations are as follows. Kazakhstan should join the Convention of Greco as soon as possible, or OECD, recommendations as part of the Istanbul Action Plan.
It seems that the fourth round seemed to be held a long time ago and the recommendations may no longer be relevant, but that's not true. Their level of implementation is very low. Therefore, we still recommend to go back to this report and to implement the recommendations resulting from that report. And that includes the Greco monitoring recommendations, as well as a more effective cooperation of Kazakhstan with various intergovernmental bodies on the issues of freezing, confiscation, and recovery of assets, prevention of money laundering, extradition, and joint investigations of transnational corruption schemes. We are convinced that these measures will significantly reduce the level of corruption, and that will help us take another step towards improving our position in Transparency International Index. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like now to give the floor to our next keynote speaker. This is Olga Didenko. She is the master student of the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Vienna, Austria, and she is the consultant on anti-corruption issues. To Kazakhstan, Olga is going to talk about the real prevention of corruption in key sectors, such as business, civil service, quasi-state sector, and responsibility or accountability of legal entities for corruption. Olga, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Tatiana. Could you please demonstrate my slides? Oh, excellent. I have a small presentation uh, in order to focus more on the three major components that relate to the involvement of business in corruption. That's the prevention and protection of informers. Tatiana already said about this, but that's one of the types of the organized crime, and Kazakhstan ratified one of the most important international conventions against transnational organized crime, and the monitoring starts this year. So, respectively, we need to focus on the petty corruption, and we need to have an action plan and systemic measures to prevent systemic corruption. It's evident that that means search for additional sources for the increase in income of the businesses. And unlike civil servants, well, businesses and civil servants, I think, are the most important players in the key in the market of corruption, in quotes, of course. That is why we need to increase the accountability of legal entities for corruption, because that means the tool set for systemic corruption, because they get income that increases significantly their actual income. And Kazakhstan does not prescribe any responsibility for that, which means that we are standing let's say, on a sidewalk. And I'm not even talking about the leaders of the Transparency International rating. All of the countries which implement or fulfill their functions under those two conventions, Convention Against Corruption and Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, well, all of them have to bear responsibility for corruption. And I'm not even talking about the criminal responsibility. I'm talking about the preventive sanctions for legal entities, which could somewhat contain the systemic corruption. And of course, the research that we see in Kazakhstan prove the fact that the businesses are significantly involved in corruption schemes and deals. The monitoring of corruption, according to Transparency Kazakhstan, shows that more than 52% of the respondents across entrepreneurs are quite pragmatic in nature, because they look for those civil servants who can help them resolve their problems whenever they receive a bribe. And others think that nothing can be resolved without a corrupt dude in Kazakhstan. And naturally, as a result of the surveys of entrepreneurs and the civil servants, the results are more or less a tie, because both of them initiate corruption deals, which shows one more time that our corruption landscape is quite vivid, and we need to take effective measures or sanctions with regards to legal entities. I really hope that this will become possible in the nearest future, and hopefully this problem will not be suspended or postponed until the better time. This question has been raised by the parliament repeatedly, but nevertheless, we need to start all over again. We still observe systemic corruption that permeated the entire state apparatus, business environment, and it's really scary, dear colleagues. One more review that demonstrates the state of corruption is the review from 2017 that was about the decrease in the level of involvement in corruption. In 2018, this indicator was about 60%. Well, this indicator reduced down to 46% by 16%. And according to this research, 63% of entrepreneurs were ready to give a bribe, and only 37% of entrepreneurs preferred to act legally in order to protect their interests. And that means that we can conduct more research. We can look at all the criminal cases or court decisions and sentences, just to see that the heads of different businesses or entrepreneurs, legal entities overall, are deeply involved in systemic corruption. That's the practical case study that you are probably aware of. We just wanted to demonstrate how the systemic corruption actually works or looks like. This is the court sentence of the two top managers. The first one was the Vice Minister of Finance. The other one was for the Deputy Chairperson of the Committee for Information. The civil servant prepared the TOR with the help of his subordinates in order to forge the documents for the profits of a special LLP. This entire procedure of the state procurement was, let's say, artificially set, that led to a bribery through the intermediary. It was the second case. We can better see that on the 11th day of his appointment to a new position, the civil servant agreed to participate in the corruption schemes. There were several LLPs who were involved in this scheme, and on a monthly basis, certain amount of money would be transferred to the banking accounts of the close relatives and spouses of that civil servant. This case highlights several important moments for civil servants and business leaders. State authorities do not really have efficient warning measures because they prove to be a failure. Civil servants tend to forget about their ethics. Whenever we look at their sentences, we realize that the code of ethics, as well as the work of the authorized bodies, seem to be inefficient, especially when the leaders of different government organizations initiate such corrupt schemes. Also, we are not sure whether or not the discretionary authorities of a civil servant were diminished. At the same time, we realize that there are always some corruption attributes. There is always a formal assessment which has been copy-pasted or even which hasn't been changed. And these anti-corruption standards include internal risk assessments, but honestly, we only observe them in the quasi-state sector, but we do not see them being implemented in practice. Of course, there are the anti-corruption expertise and other documents. And from these court sentences, we can see that these criminal schemes to get bribes are quite prevalent. What's happening to their anti-corruption culture? Do they even have any knowledge on anti-corruption measures, restrictions, or limitations? Seems like no. Therefore, we start thinking about this matter much more thoroughly, because that problem begins with the senior officials. And of course, since we're talking about the systemic corruption, we need to take practical steps starting from the top management level. We need to have some declarations or other more efficient documents and actions in place. When it comes to fighting corruption, we need to look at how the financial systems function. When we look at the concept for anti-corruption policy, we read that different crypto instruments or tools are going to be used, and we realize that people never take cash as a bribe. The bribe is normally transferred through e-payment systems, through Kaspi system, and people are not even afraid of anything or anybody when they get or give bribes. Therefore, we need to introduce or integrate the transparency element of the financial system, especially when it comes to tracking corruption. Maybe we need to include a disclaimer which would prevent further transfer of bribes through the electronic mobile payments. The senior officials normally indicate the accounts of their spouses or their personal accounts for a bribe to be transferred to those accounts. We need to take more active measures to achieve some progress in this area. I think that can also be explained by the lack of certain prevention measures in the private sector. Well, of course, there are certain formal measures, but without understanding some basic things, we will not be able to fight against corruption. In the private sector, we do not see any collective actions of the entrepreneurs against corruption. Of course, the certification has already started with regards to standards, which is a good thing, but obviously, no one prefers to report on corruption cases in the private sector because, well, and I'm going to talk about that, especially when it comes to the issue of protection of informers. It would be good to start the whistleblowing process because we are suffering from the lack of reporting on corruption deeds. People, for some reason, are either afraid to report or they're not willing to disclose that kind of information. As regards the priorities, with regards to the accountability of legal entities for corruption. Of course, there's going to be some diversion or sabotage, and naturally, the business communities are not really willing to discuss these issues. I can only assume that the anti-corruption agency understands that very well. So oh, there will be some countermeasures taken for sure. We're not having any other methods or measures at our disposal in order to fight systemic corruption in private sector. Of course, there can be some civil, administrative, or criminal sanctions imposed, and there shouldn't be any problems here because even if someone says that that is the violation of our criminal doctrine, nevertheless, this work is efficient all over the world, and we can share the global experience. And this experience helps contain or restrain corruption. We can also integrate the accountability or personal responsibility for corruption. Just like in the Great Britain, there is a special voluntary anti-corruption program. They even did some training, awareness raising campaigns, and even if there are some facts of corruption, they are not systemic in nature. It will take a huge information or awareness raising campaign because we need to make sure that these campaigns or trainings are efficient. We need to start with the risk management processes in order to teach people how to learn, how to develop the risk assessment programs or anti-corruption maps. It's really important to implement this or integrate this into the higher educational institutions' curricula, and these programs are not really great in number in different universities. A number of incentives for businesses and quasi-state sector should be offered by us. If such a program is not adopted or is not efficient or is really poor, and we still see the number of legal entities involved in corruption measures, we need to make sure that these businesses will not be allowed to take part in the state procurement or PPP and other projects. And we need to incentivize businesses to take relevant measures to fight against corruption. Some collective actions of the entrepreneurs must also be taken because I think that last week there was a meeting in the academy, in the Anti-Corruption Academy, where the theoretical experts, international theoretical experts were engaged. And it should be noted that regular measures are not enough. It's really important to demonstrate collective measures against corruption, especially when the entrepreneurs share risks, especially when a number of entrepreneurs try to fight against systemic corruption instead of just one entrepreneur, because collective initiatives and collective actions will be more efficient. Therefore, we suggest creating some platform as this problem of accountability of legal entities is very complicated for Kazakhstan, as we've never seen any cases of accountability of legal entities. Therefore, it's going to be quite difficult to introduce accountability now. We need to do the analysis of the success cases or success stories in Great Britain, France, South Korea, where the legal acts on accountability of businesses were adopted. So as part of theoretical or some applied factor, we believe we can help the agency and we can help others resolve these problems. Tatiana talked about the prevention, and it seems to me that we are not implementing a proper prevention of corruption in 3 sectors. In addition to public or private sector, we have a quasi-state sector. Just think about it. Very frequently, the systemic corruption is compared to cancer tumor. When we try to treat the cancer tumor, we try to do our best in order to remove that tumor for once and all, in order to prevent further spread of cancer cells in a body of a human. So whenever we try to introduce the anti-corruption compliance in the quasi-state sector, we need to cover the public and private sectors as well, which means that the civil servants do not have any measures that they could use to fight corruption. They're not aware of what things need to be done. We frequently talk to civil servants, and they say that they do not know about any facts about the notification on the conflicts of interests, and the conflict of interests is the prerequisite for a corruption deal if it's not prevented in a timely manner. Therefore, all the 3 sectors need to be covered by anti-corruption measures. I would like to focus on the protection of informers. You just read the draft law that is being considered by the lower chamber of parliament right now. And that's not the focus that the international obligations prescribe for Kazakhstan under those 2 conventions, because the protection of the informers is a simpler mechanism, but this mechanism is still very effective. And I do not even know what to do here. Maybe we should participate in the discussion of the draft law. Maybe we cannot do much in this area. That's the question that mostly relates to the amendments and changes to the law on the fight against corruption, labor code, and so on and so forth. And we understand that we have a very high level of protection of individuals that report on the cases of corruption, but the informers are those individuals who disclose information about the offenses that take place within the organization. Therefore, we need to take other steps or other approaches, and these actions, these approaches need to be compliant with the international standards. And because any other violations, not only the corrupt violations, need to be disclosed, and the accountability must cover all the categories of workers and even top management. And different channels need to be used, including internal, external, and anonymous channels of information. Informers need to be protected from the criminal or civil liability without the further reduction of their salaries and so on and so forth. And all of the employees need to be aware of their guarantees, and they need to know that by revealing information, they prevent corruption. And it's not a bad thing. It does not necessarily mean that they're moles, and so on and so forth. So it's obvious that there is some systemic factor of corruption in the civil service of our country, but we need to try and improve the positive level of perception of these people who help fight against corruption by revealing information.
Возможно, я, наверное, перебрала свое время.
Well, thank you very much for attention. Maybe it took a little longer, but thank you for listening. And I really hope that we will have positive mutual work. And also, Tatiana, I want to confirm that when we were reading through the action plan and we see that joining the convention is suspended again until the last year, we don't know why. Some efficient measures, some efficient issues which really help curbing corruption, we see that they're not taken in a timely manner. Okay, thank you, Olga. I want to give the floor to Janat Nurgaliev, our next speaker. He is the director of the Integrity Astana, new approaches in combating corruption. Janat. Thank you, Tatiana. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see everybody. Let me welcome you on behalf of Integrity Astana. After these three wonderful speakers, many problems have been reflected and discussed, and still I want to focus on certain issues. First, we're living in a new reality. And from the economic point of view, I want to tackle this. We see that the budget is losing the money now, for instance, because of the Caspian incident in the Caspian Sea. We can lose lots of money because the exports of oil will be stopped for a certain time. We're talking about
для того, чтобы обеспечить сбалансированный бюджет. Поэтому
of proceeds, we have to pay attention to this. And when we're talking about the state budget, we have to treat it as the family budget. We should remember about our national fund, the fund for the future generation, which has been founded to accumulate money for the future generations. And of course, in difficult times, in rainy days, we can borrow money from there, but we cannot constantly do that. And we have to avoid doing that. That's why I want to emphasize the work of our agencies, state agencies. Ms. Zharova noted some very good issues, but I think that the focus should not be on petty corruption. The focus should be on systemic corruption. And today we were talking about the reasons for the corruption, and I want to focus the attention on revision commissions. We know that these agencies are the main agencies to control the execution of the budget. And these agencies often prepare their reports after the money has been spent, after all the violations were committed. And the principle of unavoidable punishment is not really implemented. We offer to digitalize all the budgetary process. Today it has been mentioned, but we are talking not only about central level, but also local level. And not only the budget programs, to digitalize budget programs, and that's it. Many corruption crimes, they are actually within the budgetary program. programs. That's why we have to analyze the details. Let's take the budget programs on replenishment of fixed capital. Of course, that can be used to buy anything. You can send that money to modernize something, to purchase something. Soon we're going to have the problem of the energy. I'm talking about the capital, first of all. Why? Because there is corruption. And we have some projects which are not finalized. And at the budget planning stage, it is necessary to have systemic measures to curb the corruption risks. We're talking about prevention of risks, about the proactive approach, so that there is no motivation. And when more information is publicized, then there is less possibility for those maneuvers. Second, development of the methodology, which is still lacking. The colleagues from the parliament are here. I see some deputies here. Unfortunately, we don't have the methodology of the budgetary planning. And since we don't have these regulations, we don't see technical specifications on state procurement. Let's talk about sanitary and hygiene. According to the budget program, 233 billion tenge were used. This is according to the portal of the state procurement, including 41 billion in Almaty. Or if we're talking about landscaping, also there is a sizable amount of money. And when we see the specification, 1 billion tenge, there is only one line and that's it. And we don't see what kind of work, how much work, how many projects, how many goods. Don't see that. We don't even have the registry of the greenery. And this is just an example. I don't want to dwell upon that for too long. This is just an example. Third, we have to reinforce the public control over the activities of the agencies which are responsible for examination, to control the controlling agencies. And that should be done with the participation of the civil society. I can give you some figures. 1.7 billion tenge. This is the amount of violations that have been identified. And the leading region in violations was the capital city. It's 1 trillion tenge, and it's more than its annual budget. And when the revision commission sends the materials to the prosecutor's office for the previous 3 years, 34 materials were sent and only one case went to court and was registered in the system. What does it mean? It means that the punishment is avoidable. So we don't see that the punishment is going to come inevitably, inevitable punishment. The crimes were sent for the additional examination, but the additional examination had to be done by the same agency which was accused of violations.
Некоторые дела, это коррупция, вот как бы,
Some criminal cases.
статус вписан в наряд. Факт
For
выплаты
instance, an
обязательств
example, 1 billion tenge were paid in Astana for embezzlement. And there are many cases like that which have not been even investigated properly. It is necessary that the examining agency or the administrator would be left alone. They must also be controlled. I think this is the psychology of any human being. If you are doing something and you know that someone is watching, then you would be doing your job. Otherwise, not everyone is doing that. As for the revision commission, there was a rating examination on the efficiency in 2021, and Almaty is the outsider, then Turkestan region. So these top regions where there are high corruption risks related to the state procurement. So they're on the list. That's why we need to improve the control through the digitalization, and we have to cover all the stages, starting from the planning and all the other stages. We don't miss anything. And of course, we should understand that state finance is not only the budget. And these are the liabilities. This is the sovereign debt. Unfortunately, from the speech of the Anti-Corruption Agency, I didn't hear anything about the illegal enrichment legislation. If there is a resistance that you are meeting from certain lobbies, lobbying groups, we are ready to help you because we need to adopt this law. As for the declaration of proceeds and expenditures as well, of course, we can talk a lot about the corruption, but we can time limits. I just wanted to very briefly talk about some of these. And if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer. Well, thank you, Jana. Special thanks for keeping up with the schedule. And now I want to give the floor to our next speaker, our senior legal advisor of our center, Dmitry Nurumov, an expert on criminal law in Central Asia. He will talk about the criminalization of corruption, lifting the immunities, and court prosecution. And he will also talk about the return of stolen assets. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can hear you very well. Good. I think I'll start with some general issues. Of course, it has already been mentioned, but once again, I want to underscore that Kazakhstan is a party to two international UN conventions against corruption and transnational organized crime. Also, it's a member of Greco and a party to Istanbul Action Plan. So if we look at the amount of recommendations that are done as part of all these mechanisms, we will see that a significant portion of them is related to the criminal prosecution. Of course, it's clear that prevention and some other mechanisms that could stimulate good behavior, integrity, of course, they are important. But one of the most significant issues is the criminal prosecution of corruption. And another important issue is, if we look with attention, it's also the compensation of damage of the corruption crimes. The more efficient the mechanisms of criminal prosecutions are, the better are the prevention efforts. This is something quite obvious. Basically speaking, talking about the criminalization and enforcement of sanctions for corruption and improvement of pre-trial investigation of these cases, which are quite specific. As we see, a lot has been done, is done. And if we look at the concept of the anti-corruption policy for 2022-26 and the action plan on its implementation, these are reflected there. But if we talk about some concrete steps, because a lot is being said about that, but many relevant issues are actually left in, I would say, they are in a vague zone. And as Ms. Dident already said, when we're talking about some concrete mechanisms of a criminal prosecution and also reimbursement of damage, for some reason these mechanisms, although they're being discussed, their implementation in the real legislation and their practical implementation, they are suspended and delayed for the future for many years. And these tasks, we see that these tasks are discussed, but they're not really implemented. And I think people who are responsible for the anti-corruption policies, for their development and execution, and the nucleus of that, of those efforts, the nucleus of the most effective mechanisms, they are not smoothly implemented. There are some very conceptual things related to the fact that our legislation, due to historical aspects, the history is that we have the criminal code, then we have the code on administrative misdemeanors. And although the concept says that the administrative code's destiny must be solved and misdemeanors and crimes must be divided and criminal and administrative domains should be split, so far we don't really see that. And as for the corruption, there is a paradoxical situation. That the risks of the corruption are here on the table, because all the international documents, all the recommendations, they say that any corruption crimes must be criminally punished. As for the classical administrative sanctions, of course, they are possible. They can be used, and they are used in many countries, such as fines and so on. But in this case, we're talking about some administrative prohibitions. These are the cases when some things are violated related to the activities of the civil servants. And here what we see that instead of freeing, liberating the potential of the administrative sanctions
которыми
from
является
those Soviet approaches such as administrative code.
Respectively, it reflects certain elements of the criminal code. Here I'm talking about the three administrative offenses, Article 676, Article 677, and Article 678. They duplicate the criminal code. And even if the statistics on these administrative offenses shows that their use is not that frequent, in practice, we still see certain deeds. And we need to figure out whether this was an administrative offense or a crime, because in its essence, this qualification is subjective in nature, and we, in certain cases, in fact, deal with crimes. But the crimes that lead to different consequences. Respectively, there is a certain area of or room for corruption. Respectively, we need to resolve questions on a conceptual level, again, without leaving the future of the administrative code unattended. Right now, by fulfilling international standards, such as recommendations of the OECD monitoring group, we could exclude at least duplication of some sanctions. It's quite simple, and unfortunately, this objective is not present in the new concept and the action plan, even if it's the direct recommendation of OECD. And that actually stems from the logic of conceptual changes, which are supposed to be done within the concept of the legal policy that was signed by the president at the end of last year. Therefore, in principle, this is the serious reform not that complicated, but it would be quite easy to fulfill this reform and hence fulfill all the recommendations. But the duplication of the administrative and criminal sanctions for bribery needs to be eliminated. So there are not so many of these cases for duplication, and I think that law enforcers or judges see that. In fact, we see a smaller number of requests with regards to the administrative code. For example, over the year of 2021, we saw most of the requests related to Article 767 on the provision of illegal material remuneration by natural persons. As for other articles, the number of requests was much slower, except for Article 681 on the employment of persons who have previously committed a corruption offense. This article drew my attention because such cases accounted for 39 over the last year. It can be viewed as some kind of an administrative sanction in the future, but we need to keep in mind that very often we tend to hire people who are prone to corruption offenses. So it means that it's really important to improve the mechanism for tracking people who were involved in corruption deeds in order to reduce the number of corruption-related cases. And that means resolving these issues on a technical level. Now, the second aspect that I would like to focus on is the aspect of criminalization of the promise and offer of a bribe. That's the topic that is being highlighted in a number of recommendations. And it's really great to see that we actually have this concept, this element in the concept. But again, it's this task has been postponed until the end of 2023, and it's not really clear why. Whenever we watch these documents, or whenever we look at these documents, we see that the changes are promised, but when it comes to viewing the action plan, we start to notice that some of the tasks or objectives are postponed until a certain year, and then they get postponed again and again, and without any clear explanation of why a task was postponed for 2023 or 2024 or even 2025. We cannot find any explanation. I'd like to remind you that the international standard is based on the following definition of active bribery, which is the promise, offer, or the transfer of a bribe in any form, which again forms the concept of legal advantage or undue advantage to a national or foreign civil servant. And a passive bribery is a demand and receipt of a bribe, also in tangible and intangible forms. There have been many disputes about the criminalization of the promise and offer of a bribe as independent and completed crimes, and there is the certain historic tradition. Here we see certain deviation from, let's say, approaches related to completeness or incompleteness of certain crimes. But given the importance of the topic of the fight against corruption, and given the experience of other countries, we see that except for promises to investigate the corruption deeds, we do not see any specific actions. Now, let's talk about the following. If we look at the legal statistics, we will see the increase in the number of crimes related to giving bribes. And we can say that it's somewhat effective, but from the perspective of what precedes the bribe. The promise of a bribe in this case becomes more and more prevalent, and the fight against bribery again is postponed for later periods. That means that probably there are certain gaps from the perspective of primitive effect. And it seems to me that if we go back, if we decide to resolve the problem of criminalization of the promise and offer of a bribe, then this will improve the prevention effect significantly. Now, I would like to say a couple of words about the criminalization of illicit enrichment, which also was postponed to the fourth quarter of 2023. As we remember, this criminalization was also planned in previous anti-corruption strategic documents. And I am concerned that by 2023, we will not be able to implement this very important measure. What's the explanation? I'm quite interested in hearing out the explanation from those who are working on the criminalization of illicit enrichment. Could you please share your opinion why the criminalization is being postponed from 1 year to another year? Overall, I understand that here we need to pay more attention to the links between changes in the legislation and anti-corruption practices and declaration of income by civil servants. Probably this is a proper explanation, but in my opinion, we need to first criminalize illegal enrichment and only then to create new impetus towards the development of legislation and anti-corruption declaration practices by civil servants. Especially the expense part is important, because when we say about the income of civil servants, we do not really find anything serious. It's really important to pay attention to the expenses of the civil servants. It's the two-way process. And here we can state with confidence that this measure does not meet international standards and our obligations. Verification of declarations reveals indicators of illicit enrichment. Respectively, this allows investigations and prosecution of persons who may be involved in systemic corruption. In this regard, we can offer the following recommendations. It is possible to accelerate this work and criminalize illicit enrichment by offering and promising bribes in 2022. This will require the revision of the entire system of declaring income and property of civil servants and officials and organizations of the quasi-state sector. But as it seems to me, in principle, this work still needs to be done, and criminalization will serve as a good incentive. So all the responsible individuals or bodies will understand that this is a serious claim on the part of the government, and this claim needs to be fulfilled to a greater extent. It seems to me that it's also possible to start to actively develop and improve indicators and procedures for verifying declarations aimed at detecting illicit enrichment. Because it's obvious that in this area, nothing has been really done yet. Also, it's important to make sure that in accordance with the recommendations of the international bodies, we remove immunities from prosecution for corruption offenses, and accordingly, we need to conduct the pre-trial and judicial investigations into the facts of systemic corruption. There are a lot of cases when we faced some complications and difficulties, and I think that that very policy that is being pursued or voiced by the president is very powerful. However, the formal immunities may be an obstacle towards that kind of work. Well, I think that my time is almost up. I need to wrap up, I guess. Overall, of course, we need to improve the legal framework for the anti-corruption declaration of income and property of civil servants and all those who are equated to them. And we need to move to a brand new level. It is really important to have a separate standalone body that is in charge of these types of inspections. I believe that in case we have a universal anti-corruption body that does this huge work, a lot of technical moments need to be tackled as well, and such a mechanism may be very useful. I'd like to focus on one last question. It's, well, whenever we look at the analysis of sentences in corruption cases, we see normally that the investigation of facts of corruption usually ends up with the conviction of the perpetrators, and usually the monetary fines are quite common instead of deprivation of liberty or imprisonment and restriction of actions. We see that the government pays attention to the amount of a bribe, but the issues of return or recovery of assets, especially if they have been legalized in other jurisdictions, they are left unattended. So the issue of extradition are also highly relevant. We have a little a small number of such sentences or such cases where, let's say, the work would be done from the very beginning till the very end properly. So law enforcement agencies and the courts in this case stop the case whenever it's possible. If it's possible to come up with a sentence, they do so immediately by imposing basic sanctions. If they realize that it's possible to come up with a sentence for a person and at the same time provide the government with some benefits, they try to do so, and then it eventually leads to the fact that the person is released upon an early parole. It's important to make sure that this work is completely and properly fulfilled. We need to eradicate all unnecessary steps or actions in this process, because otherwise we will see a lot of property damages caused. So in my opinion, here we need to do this work by reflecting certain actions or steps in the concept. As far as I understand, that matter was not a priority back when the concept was being developed, but taking into account the changes taking place in the country right now, and given all of the changes, especially when certain people are being detained because of their corruption deeds or being replaced from their positions, the issue of confiscation, the issue of asset recovery, extradition, and so on and so forth, become even more relevant, and we could focus on them. In this regard, I would like to mention the following. We need to go back to our ratified conventions and see what could be done better. We also could join the conventions of the Council of Europe in order to seize or confiscate the proceeds from criminal activities. That the convention from May 16th, 2005, because it's not even reflected in the, this is not even reflected in the plans until 2026. We need to harness the potential and again focus on the inevitability and severity of the punishment for corruption, and we need to make sure that the punishment is not only inevitable, but it is also serious or severe. So, for example, the introduction of multiple fines as a punishment could be good, or when it comes to early parole or other matters, they are viewed as certain loopholes or concessions towards the persons convicted of corruption, and that does not necessarily reflect the serious attitude of the government towards the fight against corruption. It's important to emphasize the severity and the inevitability of punishment so that the people convicted of corruption do not consider this punishment as something not serious. Dimitri, your time is up. Thank you very much. This is pretty much it. My statement, my written speech covers more questions, and I would like to focus on them.
Если посмотреть наше уголовное законодательство, мы увидим то, что вот
If we look at our criminal legislation, we can see that there are many policing agencies that can investigate corruption crimes. We're talking about 5 agencies.
Это не способствует профессионализации
Investigate corruption crimes.
преследования
Actually, it does not help
подозреваемых в коррупции. Нужно
professional
двигаться к тому, чтобы был один орган полицейский, который
accomplishment
занимается именно этим вопросом.
of the good process agency, dedicated agency that will be doing that and that can be responsible for that. But this ambiguous jurisdiction actually shows that there is no systemic approach to combating crime. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I cannot stay with you for the discussion because I need to go to the airport. But I wish you very good, fruitful continuation of this roundtable. Well, thank you, Dmitry, for this well-detailed review in your report. Colleagues, now we can start our discussion. I already see someone wants to speak. The deputy, Madi Yulibay. I am the deputy to Majlis of Kazakhstan, and I am also the head of the working group on the draft law on amending the legislation on combating corruption. Yeah, and Anara Kokamanova mentioned that already. Yes, we already had the first reading of the draft law. It's a pity that experts have not familiarized themselves with the novelties. Olga Didenko spoke about the labor or employment. The draft law has the protection, and she said that there is only protection of those who are part of the criminal cases. But this draft law actually is going to protect the employment rights, such as dismissal or diminishing the salary or any other problems that one could experience for the sake of being an informant. He has the right directly to go to the Anticorruption Committee to initiate the investigation at the level of the Commission. Commission, which is responsible for the employment disputes. Due to the fact that the law on protection of criminal proceedings participants, we are going to introduce many novelties related to the informants. We want to introduce an amendment, and the name of the law should be actually changed. We are discussing that. That's why there is a confusion. This is a technical thing, but the principal thing is that the employment rights will be protected, employment rights of informants. How deep and effective this mechanism is going to be, we cannot say, the practice will show. But if we look into the draft law, and if your experience tells you that something should be added, then please do that, because I am going to send by email the draft law, and then you can reply to me, come up with your suggestions. And any discussions in the Majlis are now welcomed. Also, I wanted to say that one of the novelties in our new draft law is comparison of proceeds and expenditures and the punishment for the discrepancies found. As an example, if this discrepancy equals to the annual income more than 1,000 minimal calculation points, if this discrepancy is over 1 year, then there will be a dismissal of such civil servant. There is no criminal responsibility because we have the principle innocent until proven guilty. The lawyers know what I'm talking about. But the principle follow the money will be taken into consideration for the further investigation, the investigation of where that discrepancy come from. And if some corruption schemes are identified, then of course criminal case could be initiated. As for the criminalization, our draft law is going to introduce a clause to change the jurisdiction. Now, some of the crimes that were not considered to be corruption cases now are going to be considered as corruption cases, which would exclude the possibility of release on parole. Also, Dmitry Moromov spoke about the time frame with regard to the discrepancy between receipts and expenditures. It is going to be in line with the universal declaration system. The universal declaration will be introduced in 2025, and starting from 2026, the punishment is going to be introduced. And this is all I wanted to say about the new draft law. And as I also said, I'm going to provide you with my email address, so you can always contact me. Thank you very much, Mr. Ilibayev. Olga, do you have any comments? Because the previous speaker addressed. Well, thank you so much. I'm always open and glad to work in any working groups, and I am glad to provide some proposals in order to strengthen the protection of informants. if such amendments could be discussed in the Majlis, we would welcome that. And of course, we are ready to get involved in this work, and we are glad that this is happening right now. And if criminalization of illegal enrichment would be included in the law, it will help us to control the process. So, oh, thank you, Olga. Tamar,
Я хотела прокомментировать выступление
Романовна.
сегодняшних экспертов.
Yes, I want to comment
Во-первых, выразить огромную благодарность за те
on the
предложения
presentations
и
made today. Well,
инициативы,
first of all, thank you for
прозвучавшие
the
сегодня.
proposals
Конечно,
made,
концепция
initiatives
не
made.
догма,
Of course,
мы
the concept that was
будем
adopted,
совершенствоваться,
it's not something dogmatic.
к этому мы готовы выслушать
We are ready to listen
равнодушных
opinions
в
from
противодействии
everyone
и
who cares
учесть
about
возможности, все пожелания.
combating corruption.
Как уполномоченный
And the agency, as a competent agency, as a coordinating agency,
приглашает всех экспертов принять участие
invites all the
в
experts
исполнении
to
всех
take part
действий. Я хочу сказать, что
in
каждое
execution
план
of
действий
all
это
action plan
поскольку концепция реализуется на проектных рельсах.
activities.
То есть мы сейчас можем экспертов включить
We can include experts into the project
сформированных
groups.
государственных органах
Now, these project groups have been
плана действий по
formed
реализации концепции.
according to
И
the
дополнительно еще Татьяна
concept implementation procedures. That's why, Tatiana, we will take the contacts of all the experts, because today I've heard many good initiatives. And as we continue working on things like criminal responsibility of legal entities and other things, of course, we're interested. Madis Agentach, thank you for your comments on the draft law. Thank you for clarifying some of the things. As I see, not everyone is familiar with the changes expected. Some of the novelties, especially illegal enrichment, responsibility for the illegal enrichment, we expect some good results from that institute. As we heard, the first reading, these novelties have been adopted in the first reading. If we talk generally about the anti-corruption reforms, you can see that only within the last 2 years, 3 packages of anti-corruption initiatives were adopted. All of that is thanks to the political will of the leadership. Here we're talking about strengthening the responsibility, lifting the possibility of release on parole on grave corruption crimes, personal responsibility of the leaders for the corruption of its subordinates. All these measures are showing good results. And of course, what we're doing is not just to combat corruption crimes, but also to prevent them, to curb them. And good implementation of these measures, of these good measures, should be fruitful, at least we hope for that. As for the vagueness of the political will at the level of the state agencies, heads of the state agencies, yes, that is the case. We see that. We see that not all the heads of state agencies are very active in implementing prevention measures and other measures. And as you could see, the concept provides for certain measures to stimulate, to activate efforts. Also, there will be a rating on Akims, on ministers. We were looking for different options, how to build that rating, and of course, we would be very, very glad to receive any comments, any recommendations from you on how to do that actually. As for the business is also interested now in corruption, and that's the fact. Often they want their agenda to be implemented through the corruption schemes. And when we're talking about private companies, we are having only rights, not the obligations to implement the anti-corruption standards. But we hope that this will change very soon, and we will see more of that in the private sector as well. So I want to thank colleagues for your initiative once more. Of course, we would be willing to receive all of that in writing. Thank you, Anar Kalkamanovna. Yes, it's true that your agency is one of the agencies which is the most open to the public participation. And of course, our experts with pleasure would get involved. Now, Saken Nistaev wants to say something. Hello, colleagues. Well, thank you for the floor given. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can. It's a very interesting conference that we had today. Some good presentations. We fully realize that the main method of the prevention for corruption is the public control. I think everyone would agree. And I want to come up with some proposals, suggestions of mine. Now in the parliament, the law on public control is considered. We came up with some suggestions to be included. But I think that in Kazakhstan, we should legislatively adopt such a term as investigative journalism. We need to come up with that. Our fund for development of parliamentarism, we already came up with that. We submitted our proposals, and I hope that Anti-Corruption Service is going to support us. Second, speakers made very good presentations with regard to the public control. Why do I want to focus on that specifically? For instance, the draft laws are considered in the parliament. They are being discussed, and then they are publicized, posted on the portal, and then they go through the procedure of review in the lower chamber of the parliament, the upper chamber of the parliament, presidential administration reviews that, and then it is adopted. So it goes through the system of control. But then we see that there are also regulations, decrees of the government, of the ministries. Honestly speaking, these regulations are not subject to control. For instance, some joint stock companies, some state companies, state-owned companies are established, and all of that is done without any control. Lots of money is allocated, that money is spent, and then only then the government opens criminal cases, and it goes on. In Russia, there is a chamber, there is a public chamber. It's an agency. What their task is, they are doing the review of the laws and regulations. This is one of the examples, and in some other countries as well, there is such a mechanism. So we already sent it to the presidential administration, our proposal. I think it could be a good, one of the good effective methods to control the budgetary spending, the spending, the state funds, and to control activities of the state agencies. Also, Dmitry spoke about criminalization.
And indeed, I looked at the statistics of the Anti-Corruption Agency. What should be noted? Indeed, the number of corruption-related crimes, such as offering a bribe, giving a bribe, this number went up. And it means that these crimes are being investigated and resolved. But you know, when it comes to a very big bribe with the amount of $100,000 or $1 million, such bribes are not great in their number. Usually the bribes are offered or taken in some other ways. And if we try to pay attention to obvious or evident cases of bribery, then we tend to miss out on some other latent types of crimes. And here, we mostly need to pay more attention to the bribes taken by the police officers. Most of these cases are not revealed. We know about a lot of cases of how the money is being extorted by the police officers, but in order to actually start a criminal case, it takes a lot of efforts, and you know, we always tend to be in a dead end. Anti-corruption services, for example, say there is not a proof of a crime. Or even if we try to show the intent and we have the witnesses of the objective and subjective parties to a crime, it's still really difficult to start a criminal case on latent crimes. For example, the law on the entrepreneurial activity. It's a good example of the quality of different institutes, including the quality of the anti-corruption service. I submitted my proposals saying that the higher educational institutions which train specialists in this sphere paid more attention to these matters, as if we look at different amounts of bribes in Kazakhstan, let's say the amount of bribe accounts for 2 to 3 million US dollars. Just imagine how much money is being stolen by other means. Dmitry today said that it's quite difficult to track how money is being spent and for which purposes. If previously, in order to take one's money abroad, it was necessary to make a deal, and let's say there is some good that is being bought by some external organization in the UAE or in some other country. The company that sells this good can say, we haven't received our goods, or we haven't received the money, and that would be the end. But lately, I think that within the last 15 to 20 years, the functions of the supervision were transferred to the National Bank. I personally know how these things are done. If the deal was supposed to be completed within a 1-year period, by the end of the year, a notification is sent saying that the deal is not enforced yet, and that's it. The National Bank does not monitor further processes. So this is how money is being stolen. Okay, even if the money was stolen somewhere within the country, we'll be able to find it. But if the money was transferred abroad, then that's the end of the story. We cannot prove how money was stolen and where it is right now. Therefore, it is really important to pay attention to such schemes. We need to we shouldn't concentrate only on the bribes. We need to criminalize the promise of a bribe, but that's just a very small part of a very big work. I want to address our members of parliament because we, I guess, received really good recommendations and proposals today. When it comes to theft of budget means, well, there is a very good article on the on this matter, and we do not have a criminal accountability or responsibility for the ineffective use of budget means. There is an article that prescribes some light punishment. For example, I would like to focus on a specific example. There were several programs on the supply of the population of Kazakhstan with drinking water. One of the programs was launched in 2000 and it was valid until 2010. In 2008 or 2009, this program was yet not completed, but it was transferred to another program that received about 3 trillion tenge of investments. And no one back then tracked the achievement of the results. No one was responsible for achieving the results. We need to have a criminal responsibility for the inefficient use of budget means. I shared this proposal saying that there is a need in making amendments to the criminal article 181 of the criminal code, because whenever the budget means that are allocated for something, no one tracks the way this budget means were spent. I'm sorry for taking your time and covering a lot of topics, but when it comes to housing and utilities, the government offered to remove the state fee on commissioning of different buildings, which means that there are only several parties in action: technical supervision, a main supervision, a client, and a contractor. Let's say a school is doing the renovation. The customer or a client is the head of the education department. A contractor is a private company. Technical supervision and the main supervision is done by a private company. The money is allocated, renovation is not done, money is stolen. Who is responsible? This money counts for billions of tenge. Who is responsible? The head of the Department of Education who doesn't have a financial background or a construction background. If previously we used to have the state commission, it was cancelled by one state order. And now we have only 4 parties to this process that spent the budget means without bearing any responsibility for that. So if we start tackling all of these problems, it'll take a while. I heard a lot of good proposals today voiced by Anarkal Kamanov, and our members of parliament. Madiye Lubaev said really well about these matters. And of course, we will share our proposals and recommendations, but since Tatiana arranged this really great conference under this platform, I believe that this platform needs to be established in the agency as well. We have a lot of proposals or recommendations on each draft law. Let's say the law on that we're considering right now also involves a lot of corruption risks, which we need to eliminate in order to prevent further amendments to the legislation in the future. On each block of issues, we could carry out this sort of roundtables or discussions or conferences. It would be really good. It would be really good to do so. That's one of my recommendations. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sakyen. Indeed, this idea of establishing a platform that would be functioning on a permanent basis and providing opportunities for regular discussions and novelties or even changes to the existing legislation well, the idea of creating such a platform is highly relevant as we are moving towards building the new Kazakhstan, and most of the reforms are dictated by a new political course, by our new policy. I would like to give the floor to our expert with whom we've been working for a while. That's Denis Primakov. Denis, the floor goes to you. Thank you. Thank you very much for the floor. I'd like to mention a couple of things here from what have been said by most of our participants. You've talked about all the right things in the field of criminalization, in the field of prevention of corruption, and I would like to touch upon the international aspect because I'm mostly related to the international expertise. The first thing that I would like to indicate at is the protection of informers that we observe in the draft law that is still being considered. And the protection of informers mostly covers the criminal aspect and the witness protection in a criminal case or criminal justice. The protection must be ensured not only within the criminal case, it needs to be ensured even at the workspace. And we need to take a broader look. The status of an informer or whistleblower on corruption, well, these kinds of status are different. So a person must not or may not be a worker of a certain organization where a fact of corruption was found. It may be a client, it may be a contractor, it may be a counter agent, it may be a natural person who is aware of something. It's any person who is aware of the facts of violation, which means that this informer means a broader connotation compared to the definition provided by the draft law. That's the first thing. This is a separate question of how to formulate the definition of an informer. The countries of Europe decided to focus on different laws on the protection of witnesses or claimants. And there is this Dodd-Frank Act with the Great Britain, and in 2019 in Europe, a special directive on the protection of informers was adopted. And according to that law, until the end of December of 2021, all the EU countries were supposed to adopt their own laws and regulations based on that directive. This can be analyzed, of course, and we can share information about certain things. But this is a separate institute, and we're not supposed to mix it with what we have right now because we're talking about different things. From the perspective of accountability or responsibility, you know, either OECD or other international organizations talk about the effectiveness or effective responsibility of legal entities. This responsibility or accountability may be criminal, may be administrative, may be civil, but this, if in your legislation, in terms of criminal law, you do not have the clause on the accountability of legal entities, you shouldn't break down that law. For example, in Azerbaijan, they decided to break down their criminal legislation into several parts, but that did not make it more effective. You have your administrative liability, and as Dmitry duly noted, it's quasi-criminal. But historically, you have the quasi-criminal or quasi-civil law. And I agree, because corruption risks with similar elements in the administrative code and in the criminal code also disclose the corruption factor. And attracting to either administrative or criminal liability also means the presence or the fact of corruption. However, the criminal responsibility is prescribed for natural persons or individuals, and we can think about how to unify certain aspects of it. But there is the administrative responsibility that could be fixed for legal entities. By doing so, we will be able to, first of all, prevent the combination of the same intents, which can be referred to criminal or administrative cases. And this quasi-criminal administrative liability would be relevant for legal entities only. In terms of corruption risks that you are talking about, and that includes fraud and other things, it would be reflected really well as part of the new system. That's about the responsibility of legal entities. And the third thing, I will probably wrap it up on these two main factors that I wanted to draw your attention to. Thank you very much, Dennis. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions or comments? I'd like to give the floor to our participants who joined us online. You can use the function of raising a hand, or you can send your questions to our speakers through the chat box or question and answers function. We have the live streaming of our roundtable. We didn't receive any comments or questions yet, though. Do you have any other questions or comments, dear speakers? Maybe you want to share some remarks or recommendations, having listened to our presentations and discussions. Please, the floor is yours. So far, we don't have any questions or comments. Well, then, dear colleagues, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you for finding time to take part in our discussions devoted to the anti-corruption reforms in Kazakhstan. I would like to focus on the plans for the future. We are planning to make sure that all of these recommendations are presented in the form of a strategic document, which we already have at our hands. Thanks to this roundtable, we will be able to improve that document, make it more relevant, given all the comments and recommendations voiced here today. We will take into account the insights of Yelubayev and Anar Alkamanovna. We will make sure that this document is presented publicly in the nearest future by initiating additional discussions, thus proving our readiness to start engaging in the work that is being done on the platform of the Anti-Corruption Agency and Majlis of Parliament. I'd like to thank you for your time and wish you the best of luck. Have a good evening. Thank you very much. See you.
До свидания.